you're right behind the Zocalo and the Palacio.
Yeah, yeah,
Very cool, very cool. And there's probably at least 12 protests happening around you right now, um, as well as a Tiangus R12.
yeah. Every day is an adventure for sure. Yeah,
I used to be that brave, and now I just went quiet.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think, because I go back to Canada for a couple months in the summer. I think that's where I get my balance is Canada is so dormant. It's just like it's sleepy country, especially in the west, close to the mountains. It's the opposite of this. So I think I strike a balance between these two extremes.
And how does that show up in your work? Because you're painting street scenes from all over Mexico. So that balance of transitioning from Canada to Mexico City is pretty extreme. Is there balance in there?
Yeah, I mean the balance is more that when I go back to Canada, I teach and I work. So it affords me the luxury of being able to focus on my studio work here in Mexico. And I think also when you take a month or two off from your studio, you come back to it with a fresh perspective, and having sort of you get to reflect on it a whole lot. So I think that's the benefit. And then, like I said, the financial one's the big one that I get to come to a studio 5 days of the week and
Right.
make art, which is for all of us like
The
really
goal.
hard. And it's
Right.
yeah, but it's happening.
Worship at the altar of Michael.
Yeah.
Um, hey, so you've lived in Mexico City for a couple of years now, right?
Yeah,
And what was
it's
the inspiration for moving to Mexico?
well, I mean, a few things. One, I did my MFA at the Instituto Allende in San Miguel de Allende. I think I finished it in 2003. And of course, I was a lot younger then. And that was the first time. I mean, when I think back, I was pretty naive and pretty courageous, but I had never visited Mexico. I had only left Canada once in my life.
Wow.
Um, and and I also had an 8-month-old baby, and I decided I didn't want to do my graduate studies in Canada. I didn't want to go to the US, simply because a lot of the Canadian models are based off of US models, so it'd be sort of the same education. And Europe, of course, is a big leap. You got to apply for the grant, apply for the school, and hope everything lines up. And a lot of Canadians, a lot of my instructors had gone to the Instituto Allende during the 60s and 70s because Canada didn't have an MFA program. So they were going to, the Chicago Institute or the Instituto Allende, which during, I think it was in the 90s, they had a relationship. And so I learned about this school and I applied for it and got accepted. And it was one of the few schools in Mexico where I could get funding, where I could get Canadian student loan. So I went there, spent 2 years there and developed some really strong relationships. One with my mentor, Jose Ignacio Maldonado, who I would continue to go back every year. And I had, met a lot of friends that were artists, and it was sort of a weird thing when I was in Mexico and I went back to Canada. I sort of thought that the way things were in Mexico, I would go to Canada and it'd be the same. And when I say the way things were, is in San Miguel at least, and in Mexico City, there's art openings, there's shows, and people go to them. And then you go to the next show and you see some of the same people and you talk about the other work you just saw. And there's a network, and there's a community. And I went back to Canada, and not to speak poorly about Canada, but it's a young country and it's culturally very underdeveloped. Um, so I sort of, I guess I spent almost 20 years just wanting to come back to Mexico. And we would come back every year, sometimes twice a year, because my partner also has a brother-in-law who's Mexican. And so we'd come back here, and finally, like a lot of people during the pandemic, we had an opportunity to step back and reflect, and decided we'd just, rather than coming here part of the year, we'd
Rather go there.
plant ourselves. Yeah, just do the whole thing in reverse. Um,
You're kind of a you're like an extreme snowbird.
yeah, I mean, and you know, a lot of Canadians, and I think Northern Americans use this term snowbird to escape, you know, the climate. But it's usually reserved for people who have retired and who sort
Right.
of put in a life's work.
Not
And I
anymore.
feel like,
It's 2025, baby. Like the
yeah, that's
remote
fair.
workers have changed everything, particularly in Mexico City. So
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I do get made fun of that. I've become a snowbird, and I'm okay with that because you know I'm happy and
what
I'm
would the
living my
opposite
life.
be? I mean, if you're going, I mean, you go to Canada during the summertime. I mean, that's the most gorgeous time to be there, obviously. Canada's a gorgeous place as well. So I would never disparage Canada. I think it's one of the most wonderful places, and the people are relatively nice for the most part. I mean, in general, the culture is much nicer than the United States. So, are you worried about Trump annexing Canada into the United States? I saw that on the news this morning. I thought, oh, I can't wait to talk to Mark.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I have a lot of Mexicans who are talking to me about it because I think they share a lot of the feelings, you know, with respect to Trump. And I know last time Trump was, you know, president, I concerned myself a lot, but really, it not much happened. I shouldn't say that. There were a lot of horror. I think
There were a lot of things
the
that happened, but none of the more extreme things that were, it's very easy to discount his words because he's very little action based. So
yeah, but he
I
did change the mentality of
yeah,
people, which I think is even worse. I would have rather he had, you know, dropped a bomb somewhere than, you know, created this shift of dividing people and separating people, which you know Canada has, and I think right now even you know he sort of divides and conquers. So he's separating Canada and Mexico because of course the fear is that those two countries come together and just sort of skip you know Canada. But I guess that's what he'll make sure won't happen. And you know get Canadians to not like Mexicans and Mexicans to not like Canadians and people in Panama and Greenland and all over the world just to like be all upset with everyone. So knowing that that's his strategy, I tried to keep myself grounded, and just always remembering that we're all people, you know, Mexican, American, Canadian, and hopefully that transcends his leadership, and that you know whatever comes of his leadership, that uh, the good people in society are able to sort of hold things together and come out of
don't
it
worry. I don't
gratefully.
think Trump watches this podcast, so
Okay.
you don't have to, you don't have to
I
be
can talk
delicate.
shit about him.
You can talk shit if you want to, but I want to talk about your artwork because it's changed quite a bit. I've seen the stuff I seen the stuff that you've done in Canada, and I see the stuff that you do in Mexico, and both definitely reflect the cultural influences of each of those spaces. So I'd really love to dive in a little bit to the work that you're going to be presenting at the Centro Cultural Juan Ruflo. Rufo, I keep doing Ruflo, and it's Rufo, for Art Week, Mexico City, in a few weeks. A few weeks. Oh my God.
Yeah. And I'm excited about that. you know, I have stuff on the easel right now that I'm hoping to get finished by the end of the week or next week. But yeah, my work is always sort of a reflection of my environment. And my early work coming out of graduate studies was mostly figurative, because I am sort of a humanist, and to understand people, I'd always work with live models, be it full figure or portraiture, because it was sort of an opportunity to chat with people and get to know them, and also creating a space where people were comfortable being vulnerable, and I would allow myself to be vulnerable with my sitters also. So it's sort of an interchange of vulnerability, to really learn about people. And then I would say the next phase that I went into again was because Canada. Um, I'm not going to say there's not a lot of inspiration, but visually there isn't in the same way that Mexico has visual inspiration. And so my work, a lot of it became very conceptual. And that was largely because I was working in the school system in a learning through the arts school, which is based on the Lincoln Center model. And I was the resident artist. So all my work was being viewed and talked about by the students, by the faculty of the school. And I started to question a lot about sort of who we are and why we are in the places that we were. So I looked at migration, migratory patterns, why, when, how, and did work in response to that. So with each sort of piece of research, I would do a piece that would reflect that research. And that series lasted quite a few years. So I sort of went internal for that. And it was, I work that I didn't use reference for. It was out of my imagination and sort of my visions of the concepts that I was developing and the knowledge that I was learning about. And then I came to Mexico, and of course, going from Canada to Mexico, there's so much newness, and when things are new, you sort of see it with a different lens than what a local person would. And so the small things, like where people conjugate to sort of whatever the community is. Usually, it's around food, right? And that's in contrast to Canada, where everything's very sort of regulated, right? If you want a restaurant, like you got a year of permission, you got inspection, you blah blah blah. Here it's like set it up and people come, right? They
Right,
eat,
right.
and
Very
if they get
informal.
sick, they don't come back. It's just like it's really simple. So I really love those cultural pieces, and from my studio to my home, I'm able to walk it, which is about 1 hour. And that gives me the opportunity to sort of wander through the various streets and stuff and observe the cultural sort of movements and the histories and everything that's laced into it. And at the same time, reading a lot of Mexican literature, like Juan Rufio, Pedro Paramo, and about how Mexicans conceive of time, because Canadians, because of our climate, we always have to think of the future, right? Are we prepared for the winter? Not so much now because we have Walmart, but it's certainly, it's ingrained in us to always be thinking about the future. That's why we're always so punctual with everything. Whereas Mexicans, a lot of the past is part of the present, which is a really interesting idea for me. That they talk about ancestors and such, whereas in Canada, it's only the Indigenous people who acknowledge their ancestors, and that's probably because the non-Indigenous are disconnected from their ancestral roots in Europe. So thinking about these things, about time and the things that are in front of me have, this year was the 700-year anniversary of Tenochtitlan, and hundreds of years of history right underneath me. And even where my studio is, I'm on the same block as San Carlos and Posada, Jose Guadalupe Posada's studio, where he did the famous Catrina. So I just think about the art that has shaped the culture just on the block where I'm existing. And so for me, I'm also embracing the past and thinking about the past that existed before the representation that I'm creating in these paintings. So that's sort of what the drive is for my paintings. And then visually, aesthetically, it's the colors and the lights. Again, comparing the situation to Canada, where you have a lot of light pollution,
Right.
everything is sort of lit everywhere all the time. Here, everything's sort of locally lit, and it's lit by the vendor, by the building, or whoever's sort of operating that little space, and it creates for a nice environment at night. So I've found myself sort of gravitated towards these night scenes because you have high degree of contrast, which really illuminates the colors.
Mhm.
And color, Mexico naturally has color, but also now with all these LED lights, you get pink ones, you get blue ones, you get purple ones, and you get this array of lights because they'll switch their light without being consistent with what the other lights are. So you get this like beautiful rainbow of colors that are falling on all these forms, because you can have a form that's a stainless steel countertop, and it's reflecting all these colors. So for me, it's just sort of a smorgasbord of color and light and luminosity that I'm gravitating towards. Um, so that's sort of the pictorial piece, and then the final piece, I guess, would be the technical. And technically, if you saw my work in Canada, like yourself, like your work, I'm always exploring different ways that I can combine materials while still maintaining sort of like archival quality, which can be the biggest challenge, right? That
Obviously.
things will last for at least 100 years, couple generations. Um, so with this work, I've done a few things. I've started using aerosol paint, like acrylic aerosol paint, because I can sort of, in the same way that painters, we're taught to sort of block in our colors, and you do that with acrylic or with oil, whatever your medium is. And I find out if I block it in with spray paint, I get these really soft, glowy edges. So I've been doing that, and then I paint over top with oil paint. And another piece that I sometimes add, if it's appropriate, is collage. And because you have to put the collage over top of a water base before an oil, and then you have to seal it, there's some sort of layering that happens there. So sometimes I use collage, and I've also been using a little bit of oil pastel at the end, because I find combining a painter sensibility, which is sort of working in mass, and a drawer sensibility, which is working in line, it's given me a little bit more of a range and more vocabulary, visual vocabulary, to be able to describe things like, graffiti on the side of a car, like the car can be in paint and the graffiti can be drawn with oil pastel. So looking at different ways that I can really open up and expand my visual vocabulary through the materials that I use.
Yeah, and oil pastel has a more pure pigment to it as well, depending on the quality you use. I use Sennelier, which you can't get in Mexico, or have delivered to Mexico. It's probably still sitting in customs 7 years later, but yeah, the oil pastel, especially with the ability to hand draw it so quickly, the pigment saturates next to all the different layers of in the different medias that you're using as well. So it's a really beautiful way to punch and add accent to it and remind the viewer of all the other colors and how they play with each other, which is really one of the primary things in your compositions, is this balance of light and color that's really engaging to look at, beyond just the street scenes, which, of course I recognize living in Mexico, but like they have a resonance well beyond that. I think there's like a world culture of street foods in most major cities, unless you're in a Puritan city in the Americas or something, like there are many cities that don't allow it. But it's a very interesting textural quality. It's a part of life that kind of a lot of people wouldn't necessarily experience. So it makes for an interesting way to experience the culture of Mexico as well, especially if you're into the food culture.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, I know a lot of my paintings sometimes will be in the preliminary stages, and I'll have people who visit my studio say, "Leave it," like forget about the representation. Just like these, bursts of color and light and form, picking up on all these is where you should just leave them. Um, but I always, like you said, I think of the representation just as an extra piece.
Mhm.
And to use an analogy, with music, if we're thinking of a song, the lyrics are sort of a reference to something outside of itself, outside the song, outside the sounds. So I think of the representation just as the some lyrics, but really you have to have a good melody, you have to have a good rhythm, you have to have a good beat for the song to be good. And so that's why I think when I start a painting, I'm thinking about those more sort of formal things that have to work. And if they're not working, I don't even start with the representation, because it's not the main character. I know with a lot of people's work, the representation is sort of what the piece is about. But for me, these pieces here in Mexico are about the forms picking up on the color and the light, and then like you said, using the different materials to be able to describe the textural qualities and some of the surfaces that we get with them.
Are there other shows that you're participating in the next 6 months or so that we should be looking for your work at? Do you have anything planned at the moment, or? birds
it,
into
it
the new year. I'm like, tell me, give me a list of the top 100,000 things you're doing in the next 3 months.
yeah, I mean, so there's a gallery in Querétaro called La Libertad, and I'm supposed to have a show there in the spring, but I think there's been some changes with the direction of that space, and this show was booked way in advance. Probably it went way further than I was comfortable with. Like here's the show in 2 years. So communication has been a little bit like don't know if that's happening.
Right.
But that was the one that I was working on this because it's a really large space. It's sort of um, museum scale, and it accommodates about 16 large paintings. So I saw it as a great opportunity, and so I've been working really large for that reason. And while it's nice to work towards shows, sometimes the show is just a nice goal to get you exploring, and to get you working and get you committed. Because as we know as artists, showing up every day is the hardest thing. In theory, we sit back and we're like, yeah, I want to do all this stuff. But when it comes to like every day, being at the studio at 10 o'clock, that's a different thing. Because for me, it's only my partner who would ever notice if I quit showing up.
Right, right.
Everyone else's jobs, it's like their boss, their colleagues, everyone's like, hey, where's Mark today? For me, I could quit working for months and no one would know. So that's sort of I'm just accountable to myself, really.
You're telling all the secrets of the art world that it's going to get you killed, man. The artist mafia is coming into you. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to give us some insight into the work. We'll see you at Centro Cultural Juan Rufo for Art Week. The show opens on February 1st and goes to February 24th. So you have a little bit of time to experience that as well. And also your show on Artsy right now. You have a solo show with us on Artsy. So there's a couple of different places. If you can't make it to Mexico City, shame on you. You need to be here for Art Week. It's one of the best weeks in Mexico City. It's definitely one of the more explosive contemporary art scenes in Mexico for that one week. It's just insane, like Disneyland for people who love art. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, thank you for having me and for allowing me to sort of share my love for Mexico City and, like you said, everything that it brings all year round, but especially during Art Week. It's volume 11 over the top.